And welcome back to Gone Electric. I'm Evan, and today we're going to continue on with part 2 of our two-part series on whether we're all a bunch of idiots by thinking that EVs might be good for the environment. Stay tuned. Okay, so if you didn't catch part 1, I'll include a link to that video in the description below. Basically, in part 1, what we talked about is whether or not electric vehicles from top to bottom, beginning to end, emit more greenhouse gas than gas cars. And this all came about when I stumbled upon a Pew survey, a Pew Research Center survey, where they asked EV owners the main reasons that they bought EVs. And the top reason, which accounted for about 73% of the respondents, indicated that folks bought EVs to do something better for the environment than owning a gas car. Now, I'm going to use the EPA's website on electrical vehicle usage again today to take a look specifically about EV batteries. Because I'm sure, like me, some of you have heard these arguments where folks claim that because the batteries require so much energy input that they produce greenhouse gas emissions on the order of a gas car, and therefore nullifying the entire, positive impact of an EV on the environment. Let's take a look to see if that's true. Okay, so here is that webpage from the EPA. I'll put a link to this webpage in the description below so you guys can take a look. It's got, again, some really cool things you can do. You can actually use this Beyond Tailpipe Emissions calculator to calculate your personal EV's emissions over the course of its life cycle. So we did that in part 1 for my ID4. But if you guys have Teslas or e-trons or Rivians, you can do it for your car to see where you guys line up compared to a gas car. It's pretty cool. Scrolling down to myth number 2, which is our subject for today. Myth number 2, electric vehicles are worse for the climate than gasoline cars because of battery manufacturing. This is what they rebut with. They rebut with the greenhouse gas emissions associated with an electric vehicle over its lifetime are typically lower than those from an average gasoline-powered vehicle, even when accounting for manufacturing. Scrolling down a little bit, you'll see some data from the Argonne National Laboratory. Now, the Argonne National Laboratory has a link right here in this webpage. It says GREET 2 2021. When you click that, it brings you to this, the GREET model, which is created by the Argonne National Laboratory. And the GREET model stands for the Greenhouse Gases, Regulated Emissions, and Energy Use in Technologies model. Basically, they've created a model of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from EV batteries. And I'm going to save you some time and energy, although I do recommend looking at this yourself, because here is the data they've produced from that model. On the y-axis, let me stop. Again, with the graphs. If you don't like graphs, I'm sorry. We are going to move on with the graphs. On the y-axis, we've got greenhouse gas emissions in grams per mile. On the x-axis, you've got two conditions, gas car on the left and an EV with a 300-mile range. Now, there are several EVs on the market now that have a range of 300 miles. ID4 comes pretty close to that. A whole gaggle of Teslas, Rivian. I'm not sure if there's an Audi e-tron yet with 300-mile range, but it doesn't matter. Polestar 2, I think, comes fairly close. There's a whole bunch. Lucid Air, geez. So let's talk about the chart here. So again, right off the bat, total greenhouse gas emissions, much higher for the gas car over the life cycle of the car. So gas car over its life cycle, a lot more total greenhouse gas emissions compared to the EV. EV has roughly it's about 40% of the total greenhouse gas over its life cycle compared to the gas car. Now we can break down each section of the bar charts here. The orange, which is in common with the gas car and the EV, stands for other manufacturing and end of life. Now you'll see here on the right hand side that the EV manufacturing and end-of-life emissions is roughly about the same size as the gas car. You'll see that the gray, which stands for feedstock, is bigger for the EV than it is for the gas car, and we'll see why in just a second. And then the thing that is novel to the EV, which is not present on the gas car side, is this blue section, which stands for battery. That's sourcing of the raw materials and construction of the EV battery. But what is completely absent is tailpipe emissions, greenhouse gases that come from tailpipe emissions. There is no, whatever color you want to call this, gold. There is no gold bar over the EV. The gold stands for vehicle in use, emissions when the vehicle is in use. There is no emissions when an EV vehicle is in use, whereas there is a whole lot for gas cars. That makes up the biggest part of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for a gas car, is the emissions that are produced when the car is in use, over the life cycle of the car, over the years of driving the car. Now, I want to touch on a couple things here. The gray stands for feedstock. There is more feedstock required to manufacture, produce an EV than a gas car. The reason for that is certainly the battery. Now, what is feedstock? Feedstock is raw material that's used to make stuff. So, classic examples of feedstock would be corn, which is feedstock for ethanol. You've got soybean oil, which is feedstock for production of biodiesels. And you've got, crude oil, which is feedstock for gasoline. With EV batteries, the major chemistry that we have is lithium ion. And the main feedstock for a lithium ion EV battery would be, well, lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, copper, sometimes graphite. And so these things do require the type of sourcing that requires a lot of energy input. And so because of that, there are a lot of greenhouse gases that are emitted during that process. However, looking at the chart maybe one last time, 74% of life cycle greenhouse gas emission for a gas car is explained by tailpipe emissions. And on the right-hand side, on the EV, there are no tailpipe emissions. For an EV, the largest source of greenhouse gas emission is this gray box, which is actually feedstock. So it would be those raw materials that are used for making the battery. It would also be materials that are used to make electricity for when the car is actually charging, right? So there are emissions that are created to make the electricity for when the EV is actually charging. Now, depending on where you live, which is, kind of what we explained in part one, if you live in a place where the electricity source mixture is a little bit more climate friendly, say a little bit more solar dependent and a little bit less coal dependent, that feedstock and fuel portion of upstream greenhouse gas emission for the EV is actually lower. Okay, so what have we learned today? Well, once again, through looking at the GREET data from the Argonne National Library, we see that gas cars emit a lot more total greenhouse gas over their life cycle. And that life cycle greenhouse gas emission for a gas car are mostly due to tailpipe emissions. For an EV, feedstock is the largest component of life cycle greenhouse gas emission. It represents about 65% of the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. And the battery itself accounts for about 18% of life cycle greenhouse gas. So even when accounting for EV battery sourcing of raw material, construction of the battery, manufacturing, installation, EV total greenhouse gas emissions are far, far lower than a gas car. So the next time you're arguing with somebody and they want to bring up the emissions that come from manufacturing the EV battery, you can refer them to the EPA's website where they've produced the GREET data, or you can refer them to me.